Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Jake Cowling. Hi, Jack. How are you?
Good, Kieran. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Bit jet lagged, but we're getting there. You're joining some of the fantastic Australian educators who've been on the podcast. We've had Reed, we've had Danielle Cullenbrander,
Yeah.
Brendan Lee, just to name a few. And we're going to talk about lesson design because I think you had some really interesting thoughts at our conference last week. But I thought we'd start with a bit about who you are and how you got to where you are today.
Okay. So it's sort of, I've actually, the questions that we sort of dabbled throughout the week and what we would talk about today, it sort of branched into that first question. Because I kind of want to talk about my experience as an educator, where I first started to where I am today, because it sort of answers that first question. And I think what is meant by lesson design, right? We wanted to speak about that. And so I want to go back and start of my career where I graduated university and I sort of got, you get thrown into full-time teaching, juggling lots of things. And so in 2016, it was essentially, the love or the romanticize of balanced literacy was there. And so I fell into a school that was really into that inquiry-based learning. And as myself as an educator, look, whatever the school's doing, I'm wanting to implement as well. So essentially, I did that. I did my best in terms of, inquiry-based learning, play-based learning, and essentially from there, was trying to implement those techniques. In a nutshell, it's essentially like, okay, here's a mini lesson. And so the mini lesson would be the I do, we do, you do. And then should be a bit of an explore and play and sort of, work with that explicit concepts. And so therefore the teaching explicitly was only a short amount of time. So maybe I think mini lesson being 10 minutes. And then therefore after that, the rest of the lesson is a bit of independent practice, sort of following through with what that explicit teaching was. And so over time, my initial teacher training at the schools was like, you'd have the expert teacher come in, sort of provide feedback, and then we'd have a little reflection session, and then she would leave, and they'd be like, "Okay, cool, all right." Essentially, that's what I thought was, good practice in terms of reflecting on that, and then being able to put that into the classroom. But then over time, uh, this big change in terms of science of learning, science of reading. Reflecting back on that, it's sort of, you know, I felt like, at that time, at that moment when I was an early educator, I was sort of getting frustrated. I'd have these helpless hand raisers, always putting the hand up and thinking to myself, "Oh, what's going on here? Like, I'm being doing, I'm doing what's told, like from the expert teacher, and I'm sort of not really seeing the effects of my teaching practice, and it really got me into a rut, to be honest. And for the first 2 years, I sort of really, played it off, as you'd say, oh, it's the kids' fault, they're not learning. And in reality, that's not the case. It's actually your teaching practice. But I was following essentially a lesson design that wasn't that effective. But in hindsight, I wasn't really knowing that it wasn't effective. I was just doing as I was told, thinking that was best practice. And so that was essentially at the start of my teaching career. And then as I got towards moving to the UAE, I got exposed to the science of learning, science of reading. And that truly got me to reflect on that time that I had my first stage of my career and think, wow, I spent a lot of wasted time on this sort of instructional, framework or lesson framework where it really wasn't working. And I was just, banging my head against the wall and not really like thinking too deeply about it. But, you're a beginning teacher, right? So you have all these other things that you're sort of worrying about. You try and do the lesson framework, you're trying to build a relationship with your students for the first time in your classroom. So you can't really blame yourself in terms of that, but not thinking deeply enough because you've got so much going on. But um, you know, in hindsight's a good thing. And thinking back now, I think that, all that research informed practice that has come out has been absolutely brilliant. It's been a game changer for myself. And it's sort of been like a snowball effect because of that prior experience I had. I sort of learned from that and it was like, oh, this is what happened, in 2016, 17. And oh, this is what I'm doing now that I wish I could talk to my past self and tell past Jake about what things are best practice, and what should go into effective lesson design. So yeah, that's sort of my context and my subjective trajectory as a teacher. I know that everyone's different. You may have had really good professional development, or you may have had none at all. There's that different sort of curve, I guess, in terms of what sort of practice you have had. But that's been mine essentially.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a rite of passage, to be honest. Certainly, those of us
Mm,
who are sort of following the evidence informed or research guided sort of pathway, I think at some point there was a threshold moment where we sort of went, "Oh my goodness." But I don't think we can hold it against ourselves, because I don't think we can expect to be too impactful in the early part of our
mm,
career anyway. Like you said, the stuff like behavior,
exactly.
relationships. Once you get those down, then you can focus on your professional development and your practice in the classroom, I think.
Yeah, exactly right.
When we're thinking about lesson design, we're thinking about the thought that we put into how we structure sort of our pupils' engagement with the sort of content we want them to really think about and spend attention on. What ideas, concepts do teachers need to have a grasp of before engaging with lesson design in a really meaningful way?
Like learning from what I've learned from the last couple of years, it's about knowing the why behind each component within a lesson. But then also knowing the what, what's included within that lesson component. And then obviously the how. And then that's where your instructional coaches can come in and show you how to do it. But then also the instructional coaches can tell you why as well, right? So that really helps. And I think, learning about that, and there's a few books that come to mind. Explicit Direct Instruction by John Hollingsworth, Sylvia Ybarra, is essentially, I like to classify it as a Bible for, explicit instruction for myself. Learned so much about it, and understanding that why about different components in the lesson is important, but then also knowing that there's a kind of nuance between the why and the what of a lesson component. So let's take, for example, activating prior knowledge. As teachers, I think that's quite an easy concept to know why we do it. You're activating memories, semantic memories or episodic memories from long-term memory, bring it down into working memory to apply it to a new concept that they're learning, right? So, I think that's quite easy to understand that that's the why. But then when we understand that that's the why, maybe we think that the what is just as easy, where in fact, well, activating prior knowledge, you can classify in different terms, right? And so I think this book was really eye-opening for me, this explicit direct instruction. I think John sort of states it, that there's two different types of activating prior knowledge. He uses so activating prior knowledge can be like a universal experience or a sub-skill review. And so, for example, in math lessons, it's mostly generally all the time, a sub-skill review. So, adding some fractions before you're talking about adding fractions with irregular or do not, improper fractions, for example. So, doing a sub-skill review is essentially what you would do for activating prior knowledge in maths. But then also in English, it's maybe activating so some episodic memory, so universal experience. So comparing and contrasting, what's the difference between a lion and a cat? Okay, so that's activating prior knowledge there. And so then therefore you can go into this sort of spiral, and it works well with the title of your podcast, Thinking Deeply, right? Thinking deeply about activating prior knowledge. There's so many different ways that you can activate it. And so the why is easy, but then the what as well is, it can be quite lengthy. On the flip side of lesson components, like teaching the concept and then teaching the skill, right? So teaching the concept, the why behind it can be quite lengthy. And then the what, it can be quite short. So yeah, I think that in terms of knowing what is research informed in terms of components and what you should have in them, but then also understanding the what, the why, and the how goes a really long way in terms of being an effective teacher, I think.
I love that level of specificity, because then when you are thinking about it, you're really thinking about, well, how does this work in my context, in my classroom? And what are my available options? I love the
Mm.
idea that teachers are so expert that they know exactly which sort of string to pull at which moment, stuff like that there. Where do you go when you're not sure about the relationship between the why and the what. For instance, something like retrieval practice, we understand why. Where do you go for your to find out, what is it? Test in your classroom, or are you looking at particular
I think
sources?
I think as teachers, we always got to test it out in our own classroom and see how it goes for ourselves. And that retrieval practice has been another component of lesson design. I guess has been fundamental in terms of learning from my classroom. But yeah, and so I'll talk again personally about my experience. It's not research informed, but I guess it could make some links to some research, as most education practice does. But like retrieval practice, I think of they use that terminology. I remember listening to your podcast with your last presenter. I forgot the name, forgive me, but he talked about drill and kill and talked about how you're drilling and killing. But I like to think about in retrieval practice, are you really what are you killing essentially? What are you killing? You're killing the motivation of the students. Well, in that fact, then that's something you don't want to be doing. But is thinking about drilling, is drilling a good thing as well? Well, as a teacher, I think it is, right? So drill and kill, well, we want to be drilling, but then what do we want to be doing as well in retrieval practice? And that's where you flip the killing, right? You don't want to be killing motivation, you want to be increasing it. So then you should be drilling and motivating, right? And so that's what I think, in terms of retrieval practice. I feel like, I use this like analogy. I think to myself all the time, like, I feel like it's a CrossFit class in retrieval practice, or it's like a F45 session, like you're being the motivator, but knowing when to motivate, right? And so knowing when to prime students just before they do like that retrieving of previously learnt information is so important, I think. So yeah, I think it goes into, to answer your question, it goes into trialing it yourself and seeing what works, and but then reflecting back on that why as well. And it's sort of like you're going backwards and forwards from that research and then implementing it and then seeing what works and seeing what doesn't. Because I know for myself, I've had experiences where there's that subjective sort of feeling in yourself where you may have taught the lesson, the day before, and then you do some retrieval practice on it, and then forgetting happens, right? And it really hits your heart really hard. You're like, oh, man, like, thought that lesson was really good yesterday, and then they can't retrieve it the next day, and you've got to think about the fundamentals of retrieval practice, right? What has it got to be? It's got to be perky pace, and it's also got to be a wide variety of topics per se. If you're doing like maths, you want to try and hit all content all at the same time, and so you don't want to forget that. But sometimes that feeling draws you away, and you go and in the retrieval, you stop the retrieval practice and you reteach it just to make sure. Hang on, we just did this yesterday, but learning from that as well. Like you shouldn't be doing that. You should just have that in the back of your mind. Okay, essentially, some forget. They forgot. Like I'm going to maybe reteach it later on. The point of retrieval right now is at a perky pace, getting as much done as possible, drilling and motivating. So essentially, you're not killing the motivation, you're increasing it. And ways I would do that is like it's a lot of priming before the questions or priming before the retrieval practice. You'd be like, hey, you know what? You know what's going to set you up really well today? We're going to work hard here today, boys and girls. But to make sure we do that, we need to make sure we have our back straight, we have our good writing posture, and we're thinking deeply about the questions. If you know the question really easy, I've got this, this stretch task for you. I've got little routine cards for those students that, answer the retrieval question quite easily. All right. How can you challenge yourself today? Stretch your thinking. And so you would motivate them that way, or prime them that way, and sort of like reflect as well at the end of the retrieval practice as well. I think it's really important. It's like, how do you feel? Like you got some really good, lots of small wins today for you boys and girls, lots of correct answers today. You should be very proud of yourself. All right, let's do this again tomorrow. And so sort of, you're not killing the motivation, you're actually increasing it by doing that. So I think that's quite important as well.
I mean, that sounds fantastic. I really like the way you've got this really tight sort of set of points that you want pupils to engage with. You're really
Mm.
clear on how people should engage with the thinking here. How do you allow yourself the time to think these through yourself? So they're the type of reflection that gets you to the point where you've got that routine in place. Is there something that you do that helps you get there, or is it just a part of you? It's just the way you sort of develop your
So to
thinking.
help me get to what I've done in the classroom and how I get there, look, just having those reflections at the end of the lesson, I think, is quite important. But do we always have time for them as teachers? Not really. But I think what was been really helpful for me is like videoing my own lessons, and just getting over that curve of, hating the sound of your own voice, essentially. But, being able to look back at that and be able to analyze the bits and pieces of, your explanation in the lesson, or maybe, how you engage with the students as well. But then also have a granular focus on, with that video, because video is like a huge piece of transit information. You sort of really got to narrow it down. And so I myself, a couple of coaching books, responsive coaching books that I've sort of read that, essentially you should be just focusing on that crumb. And so I like to do that. Helps my cognitive load. And then I just go week by week. I started this with behavior routines, actually. I had quite the challenging class last academic year, and essentially it has really set out routines and examples of what the teacher would say and examples of what the student would say. And I found that to be tremendously helpful to guide myself on, if X happens, this is what you need to do as Y. And so I would video myself, and then I would have that book out, and then the set of instructions of what to do, and then be able to reflect back on that in the video. And I would only, I'd flick through the video, because you know how long the videos could take. You flick through, oh, I know when, this student act up, and I'm like, oh, okay, what did I do here? So essentially, videoing to answer your question is something that I think that I think teachers need to get over that hump of that hurdle of, it is quite embarrassing to some extent, filming yourself, but it is quite helpful, and it does go a long way into long-term retention of, new routines that you want to implement. Definitely.
Hopefully, not doing you a disservice. When we're thinking about lesson design, we're thinking about the what and the why, about what those routines might look in our classroom, and then finding time for reflection to really refine it. Is there anything else you think we should have in mind before we start engaging with this?
Well, the students, of course, and where they're at academically. The context of your classroom, essentially. So to attack that, obviously you got to have your data sets in place, but then also, how your students are motivated and engaged with particular tasks. But that's also sort of how you as teachers got to build that motivation through consistent engagement norms that everyone can abide by. And it's not going to be a song and dance to try and get everyone involved, right? So I think at our school, at Australian International School, we picked up that from explicit direct instruction, having engagement norms where, students are doing something within, you maybe done 1 minute of teaching, but the students are doing something after that as well. So yeah, just thinking about engagement of students, thinking about their motivations as well to answer your question, Kieran.
Where your students are at in their sort of their propensity for routines and things like that there, and the expectations you have on them, because like you were saying, you outline here's the reasons why we're going to work in this way. If they're used to that, I think your starting off point, your jumping in point is much greater developed. I mean, how do you ever see that distinction, and do you do anything differently to help prime your students for thinking in this kind of way?
Depends on to what extent. uh how far do you address the routines? You can sort of, as a teacher, you can sort of sense it. Like, are they going to be on the ball here? You can sort of sense that they arrive in the classroom. You come in from lunch, and a couple of boys being a bit boisterous. But okay, well, I'm going to have to set the norms and routines here before we start the lesson. But it's always good to do it when you think they're not as well. I think that, every lesson that I do, I would be setting the norm. Okay, can you just remind me, boys and girls, of how how you chin your whiteboard? Can you do that? I'll do that mostly every day. Yeah, every day. And then, okay, don't forget to put your the end of your marker on the mark, so your marker's ready there to write with. I'd just be like all those little bits and pieces. I would be priming before any lesson because those are the little things I do forget. But then over time, when you build those habits and routines, the kids will be looking there like, and then they'll be trying to point to you, hey, Mr. Jake, I've got this here ready for you. I've done what I knew what you were going to say, and I've done it. Can I get some recognition for it? And so, that's where the routines eventually come into place, right? And so you give that good feedback. Oh, thanks, little Ahmed. Excellent. And you have your, extrinsic reward system in place as well. But I have like marbles in the classroom, fill up the cup of marble for their group table, they get a reward. I think that's always important. But yeah, always priming in different ways of behavior, expectations. Yeah, I think it's a great classroom management strategy that I think previously myself I took for granted, and I thought that I've done that first 4 weeks of drilling in those routines, and then you get to week 11 of term one and then they've forgotten them, or like maybe they're getting a little bit loose with the routines, and then you have to do it, and then you bring them back in, and then you have to be the bad cop essentially with those routines. Whereas I think that if you're doing it every day, you don't have to be that bad cop eventually during the term, and it can just be that light touch essentially of priming them with what to do and what's expected, in a friendly way. So yeah, I think that's what's important. It's got to be consistent across the whole year.
What are the challenges of engaging with this type of approach to teaching and learning?
In terms of teaching and learning and lesson design and components, I think that time is the main one. Teachers are time poor. And then deliberately practicing these techniques through rehearsal and self-coaching. I think we as teachers take for granted what we do know, but then we don't know what we don't know. And so, we come into the classroom and, maybe deliver an explanation, and then it falls flat. And then that's maybe because we didn't rehearse it or we didn't practice it before coming in. And so that takes time. And so we're time poor as teachers. So I think that's a big challenge when engaging with this type of teaching and learning, and being able to obviously put in the time and effort of, researching the why and the what and the how in terms of lesson components. That would be the main challenge, I think. Another challenge would be maybe breaking old habits too. I know that there was, Peps McRae does some great little blog posts. I can't remember off the top of my head, but talking about how, maybe teachers are at different stages of their career, and, you've got maybe a retiring teacher that's set in some routines, and if you really want them to be, doing the most contemporary type of teaching with the proper lesson design of what we think is best by research, well, that's going to be hard to break, isn't it? So that's going to be another challenge, depending on where you are in your career, how you approach it. And yeah, I think that's where it comes into, people above me as a teacher. I think, leadership in schools need to implement those instructional coaches and really bring in a culture of, systematic understanding of what is good lesson framework, and really promoting that amongst teachers, and then having that shared discussion amongst teachers, I think, is really important.
Basically, trying to get to the heart of if I can see the value in thinking in this way and behaving in this way as a teacher, but anyone listening may think, well, there may be blockers, and so how would you overcome those? So yeah, like you say, having the support of others in your school, finding the time, they can be related to each other in some respects, and equally trying to shift your own thinking if you've been set in your ways for a while. Because I know some things in maths take me a long time to shift my thinking. I'm always trying to be open to shifting my thinking, but some
Right.
things you just do for so long, don't you?
Yeah.
So I mean, like, if anyone's thinking about this and they're thinking, okay, here are the challenges that I might face. How do you what is your approach to sort of addressing those and really sort of stand firm in the face of the difficulties of being a teacher day to day?
I guess I could only talk from subjective experience for myself, really, and I'll just state that I think what got me over the line was, yes, I maybe put in the extra time, maybe work on weekend, read the books on the weekends in terms of, Explicit Direct Instruction, and read that book many, many weekends when I first started getting introduced to the science of learning and the science of reading, and a few other books too. And it sort of snowballed. And I think the hinge point was when I sort of saw the results in my classroom, um, and that was a turning point for me. It's like, okay, I put in this huge investment. Um, I'm just going to see how it fits, see how it works. And I know that's not the same as everyone. Everyone's not going to be, maybe motivated to put in that time. But I certainly was. I was thinking, okay, I think the message across from leadership to me was that, science of learning was quite a big sort of thing, but it came to me as quite intuitive. And I thought, well, that makes sense to me. I'm going to start having a little bit of a self-development journey here. And so I did that. But then I think once I started to see the impact on that in the classroom, I was like, I sort of had that snowball effect. And so I think that, once that started to happen, it just kept on going and going and going. And then it got to the point where I was like, hey, you're sharing with a colleague, oh, this is awesome. This is what happened today. And this is the book or the research that I read to do with this. But you can only have so much impact as a teacher. I think that's got to come from above me. As a teacher, it's got to come from leadership and be able to systematically deliver that to all the teachers in the school. And so, yeah, I think that's quite important.
In the long run, I find that this kind of thinking saves you time further down the line. I don't know about you, but once you've got those kind of routines in place, you're not reteaching stuff as much as you may have in the past. I certainly wasn't. And
Definitely.
your general day to day experience is a whole lot more enriched because of the systems you put in place.
Yeah. And I feel like it's a bit more systematic in my way of thinking too. How does a day look? X, Y, and Z, and then how's the next day look? Or maybe looking a little bit different, but the instructional routines don't really change that much. It's quite low variance, and it's quite easy for you to then go ahead and apply something new and something different, and then practice that routine. Yeah, I think that the science of learning has not just been crucial for students, has been crucial for teachers as well, about how you learn things and what you should do. And maybe you should space out the practice of you reading that book. I might go and reread that chapter again, just to familiarize myself. It's been tremendously helpful as well.
Because you always take something different every time, and with greater expertise or experience, you can think, "Oh, now I see what they were talking about there."
Mm,
I think
mm.
the world over, we're in this situation where a lot of us are having to, do the reading in our own time. But in my mind, I dream of a world where all leaders are sort of providing this sort of conditions in which teachers can engage with this stuff. We'll see if that ever actually materializes or not. But I think your lived experience will resonate with lots of our listeners.
Yeah, well, take it from me. I was pretty much the broken teacher wanting to quit, multiple times, and came across this whole science of learning approach. I was like, oh, this is a game changer for me. It's not just about reading; it's about everything in terms of teaching and learning. Yeah, and that's why I'm a huge advocate for instructional coaches. Is this whole instructional coach wave happening right now? And I just think to myself, my first couple of years of teaching, I'm like, oh man, imagine if I had someone like that with me when I first started teaching. I'd go, oh, where could I be? Where would I have been now? And so I'm so glad that schools are doing this sort of instructional coaching approach, because I think about those. I don't think about experienced teachers. I think about the beginning teachers who start out fresh out of university. It is quite hard, and having that sort of systematic approach for everyone, not just beginning teachers, but for expert teachers as well, is so important.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to see how passionate you are about education now. So that that in itself showing that you can if you were at the edge and now you're far from the edge now,
Right.
that's amazing.
Yeah, no, it can definitely flip the script, that's for sure. I don't know, I was thinking about playing golf after I finished work, whereas now I'm thinking about, okay, what's the next teaching practice? Weird how that works, but anyway. But yeah, essentially, I cannot agree more with the current research that research informed practice, very, very important to us as teachers, and so helpful. But I will admit it does take time and conscious effort.
Do you ever have any of your best ideas on the course? You know, where you're in total like tranquility around you and you go, oh, I could do that.
Oh, always thinking. Yeah. Oh, I get into these little obsessive modes, just, but not on the course. No, no, the course is mutually exclusive from teaching and learning thinking. I can, think about the ball and where the ball's going to go. Let's definitely, yeah. We have a rule with my friends that, we're not talking about work when on the course. And I think that's a common rule amongst many golfers.
Yeah, that's healthy. And you're supposed to clear your mind, aren't you? So
Yeah.
that's probably why I'm not a very good golfer. What are the benefits to teachers and students of shaping our thinking in this way?
Deeper thinking, deeper understanding, underlying the principles of effective instruction, for teachers, of course, and just knowing that why behind everything you are doing, it just gives you so much more confidence, I think. Um, going back to that activating prior knowledge thing, I'll be honest, like when I first started teaching, it's like, oh, it's just something you do at the start of the lesson. And it didn't have much depth to, I had a surface level understanding of what it sort of meant, I had a little bit, but then understanding it just that little bit more, it gives you that confidence to actually, you might get some, like teachers love to adapt from lessons off, resources. You'll be able to look at that, activate prior knowledge question on that particular resource that you downloaded, and you'll be able to say to yourself, well, that's not a good question. I'm going to change that. Whereas before I'd be like, oh, okay, that's what the resource has. I think that it must be good, right? And so you're able to critique, and adapt much more deeply than you initially are. And especially with all these new resources and free resources that do come out, I think that that's really crucial to adapting to your context of your school and your class as well. Really, really helpful. So yeah, just like a grasp, having that grasp of the underlying principles of effective instruction really helps for teachers. Essentially, if you have effective instruction, effective learning takes place. It's quite simple, really.
Yeah, like I said, with greater expertise, greater opportunity to really evaluate things. I think like you said, it's really important because there are lots of different options we have, and particularly in mathematics, there are lots of different ways to approach it. But
Mm,
having that sort of a critical eye based on prior knowledge, I think, is really, really important. I
mm.
mean, is there anything you're thinking about at the moment and think, okay, my next sort of not project, but the next thing you want to refine in your practice? What are you thinking about at the moment and sort of doing the pre-reading before you get into
Mm.
it?
I think that well, I've sort of had a niche in vocabulary instruction over the last year, and I've presented a few presentations to a couple of audiences at school and beyond. I think it was Research Ed when I first presented explicit vocabulary instruction. I think, going deeper into that, I can find, my knowledge can transfer to other realms of education. I'm sort of starting to see that too, and it sort of got me into, maths vocabulary and how math, how we should be as teachers codifying mathematical language and thinking deeply about or critically about, the critical attributes of definitions of math words and where they actually could be used much earlier than much later. And so, recently I've been thinking about some, particular math words, for example, variable, right? There's only one critical attribute to that word, unknown number, right? And so it's really, really easy to teach. And I just think to myself, why aren't we using that word variable in lower primary um, instead of saying unknown number? Because if they've got more opportunities to listen and hear that number in context, well, when do they get to high school? That's not something they're going to be thinking about. That's going to be automatic. And so I'm starting to think about deeply about like, okay, how complex is that mathematical or vocabulary word? Has it got one critical attribute to the definition or has it got more? If it's got less, well, then we should be using it much more earlier. And I state this with another example, like distributed property. You may not be using it. You might be saying, oh, split strategy, just, the vernacular term, you might think to yourself, oh, the kids could understand that quite much more easily. But in reality, you could probably be saying that word distribute within the class and within a context that the students understand. I'm distributing your papers equally, or the librarians distributing the books to everyone equally. I think kids can understand that quite easily, and so I think that it's really, really important that we need to be start thinking about as schools like codifying mathematical vocab and bringing in those words that are much more like in high school variable, all those other math terms. You could be bringing them down into in primary education. I think as teachers, maybe we go away from them, maybe because we don't know them that well ourselves. That was maybe the case for me in terms of, oh, hang on, I've always learned a split strategy. Oh, just distributed property. Oh, okay, right. And so yeah, that's something, I don't know, maybe that's my next niche and project. I think I'll still be going down that explicit vocabulary instruction line, but then, delving into different subjects and how it's approached in maths and maybe how it's approached in science as well.
You're going to be making the journey all the way over to London on January 18th to speak about this, is that right?
Yeah, yeah. And so that's a good segue, isn't it? Nice one. Yeah, so yeah, I'll be delivering my speech. I've sort of presented throughout the year this year on explicit vocabulary instruction, what it entails, what it is, what it isn't, sort of some theory behind it as well. So yeah, I'll be looking forward to delivering that in London, making the trip over.
Yeah, so yeah, my brain might be mush, but the professional, it's like muscle memory, making those segues into it. Yeah, so I mean, it'd be
Yeah,
absolutely fantastic to have you. And
yeah,
just to remind anyone who's listening, that's the TDAPA conference. We're raising money for Valindra Cancer Centre, and tickets are on sale. I'll make sure I link in this, and maybe try and get your little promo material to time at the same time. That's it.
no
Really
problem.
appreciate you coming to join us.
No, appreciate it, Kieran. Thank you so much.
And so I think it's been really fascinating. I'm hoping you'll come back and join us in the future, maybe part of a group chat where we're exploring some of the nuance and the detail in some of the things we've discussed today. All I said to do is say thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Kieran. Yeah,
At home.
thank you for the opportunity as well, obviously. Thank you.
No, not at all. My pleasure. Thank you for giving me part of your day off. I really appreciate it. You could have been having another one of those nice coffees instead of instead of chatting with me.
I'm going to have one now.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.